Stories of Being is a series of conversations with a range of inspiring humans whose approaches to life each offer an important piece of the puzzle for how we go about creating the fairer, more balanced, connected and beautiful world we long for. Each conversation explores a new perspective on how we view success, connection, power and progress, and offers inspiration and guidance as we collectively transition to more harmonious ways of being with ourselves, each other, and our shared home. In today's episode 1 of this new podcast, I talk to Katherine Trebeck. Katherine is a political economist, writer, and advocate for economic system change. She co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a group of people working to rethink our current economic system. She's a writer in residence at the University of Edinburgh, a strategic advisor to Australia's Centre for Policy Development, and she also sits across a range of boards and advisory groups. She's done a lot, and she continues to do a lot. But I think more importantly, she's just a genuine, lovely human who was willing to take the time out of her day to chat to me on a podcast that didn't even exist yet. And I'm so grateful that we were able to have this conversation. I think I found it to be a really interesting conversation, and one that maybe doesn't happen all that often. When we think about what change needs to happen to create a kind of fairer and better world for everyone, the economy isn't necessarily discussed. So I hope that, you enjoy it and kind of, it just gets you thinking. Creating and making a podcast is extremely uncomfortable in many ways. So thank you for listening. Feedback is always welcome. I really just hope that you enjoy this episode and get something out of it. I've started recording episodes before launching it, and I've been thinking about what episode I'll start with. And I thought this one could be a really good one to start with because the economy kind of seems to be at the heart of so many of our problems as like people, but then also the planet. So I just really wanted to kind of chat to you and hear about the work that you do and how you even ended up in this space.
Oh, Ingrid, there's a sensible answer to that, and then there's the real answer. And so the real answer is, I followed interesting projects, and one door opened, led to another interesting project. And there's a lovely Scottish phrase. It says your feet will bring you to where your heart is. And I think just in retrospect, that's what's happened, that I'm in this incredibly, really fortunate and exhilarating space where I get to work on topics I feel really passionate about and I find really interesting, and also work with really, really cool people. So it has been a sort of almost stumbling into it. But in the sort of the longer version of that answer is I was working with Oxfam for a long time, for about 10 years, and really loving that work, very passionate about global justice questions and poverty reduction. And Oxfam was getting particularly more interested in the impact of environmental breakdown on poverty and development questions, and was really seeing in the work Oxfam did around the world how much environmental damage and environmental catastrophe was undoing some of the progress that had been made in development. And so all those questions were sort of raging around in my mind. And I was also working for Oxfam's UK focused programs, a really small part of Oxfam's work, and particularly focused on Scotland. And what was really apparent there, that this rich country in GDP terms, one of the 6 richest countries in the world, still had extraordinary problems. And this was sort of back in the early 2000s, and was really apparent where I was living in Glasgow, that there were parts just down of the city, just down the road from where I lived, where life expectancy was in early 50s for men. And I joined Oxfam at the time of the Haiti earthquake, and that was higher than the average life expectancy in Haiti. And so I started asking all these questions about what is going on here? If economic wealth is not an automatic route to delivering good lives for people, what questions do we need to start asking? So I started just sort of diving into those questions about what is it about the nature of the economy, and really realizing and learning how much all different issues, whether you're passionate about the environment or about social justice or about employment issues or almost any other topic, there are economic roots of the challenges, but also the possibility there. And so almost that cliche line, "It's the economy, stupid," started to just sort of emerge really, really profoundly for me.
And when you started asking those questions, did it feel like you were kind of the first one to do it in a way, or that those questions were new to lots of people?
Yeah, not by any means. And I've got so many sort of intellectual heroes that I've learned from and drawn on, and sort of really I don't feel an expert in any of this. I feel I'm sort of weaving together sort of other people's expertise a little bit. Having said that, though, in so many civil society organizations particularly, and also often a lot of government policy as well, is focused issue by issue. It's about responding one crisis to the next and not taking the time to see the patterns between them. And so back in these Oxfam days, this is about 15 or so years ago now, did a program of work where we worked with folks who are working on all sorts of different issues themselves, whether it was cancer or health inequalities or poverty in the UK or consumerism or taxes, and just started weaving together how they are all connected when you start looking upstream. And I think just giving people the space to have those discussions was really quite powerful. And it sort of in retrospect, it built a bit of a movement in Scotland that was a really strong basis to then push the Scottish government on how it conceptualizes progress, success, and that led to various moves by the Scottish government to reappraise its understanding of success. It revised something called the National Performance Framework, which is a multi-dimensional wellbeing framework, which now, of course, Australia's talking about having something similar. And it meant having those conversations in the early days of that really meant there was a constituency and a community of practice that wasn't just me at Oxfam, or it wasn't just individual organizations. It was unions, it was churches, it was business organizations, it was social justice organizations, it was environmental groups who really said, we're all connected to this and we want to see action on it.
Yes, I'd love to come back to that more, I guess, holistic and connected way of thinking. But just going back to something you said a little bit earlier, is you mentioned GDP. So obviously that's probably a term, most people are aware of, and it's, currently how we measure the success almost of a country. So I'd love for you to kind of talk to almost the origins of GDP, what it kind of looks like, and I guess where the challenges may be with using that as a metric of success.
Sure. Yeah. So GDP was created by a chap in the US called Simon Kuznets back in the sort of post sort of depression era, to really start to help. It was Roosevelt at the time, sort of measure what the impact of policy levers on the depression and hence the economy. And Kuznets was really humble about it. He said you should never measure the welfare of a nation through these numbers. What happened is in the post-war era, it became adopted as almost a proxy for the success of a country. You had the sort of Cold War competition between the sort of the communist bloc and the West, sort of competing, whose GDP is better. So very much both using that framework. And you also had a whole lot of institutions that were formed after the Second World War, called the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and so on, that then reinforced the use of GDP through various accounting rules and really formalized it, despite its creator saying, hang on a minute, this shouldn't be used. And what it does is it counts what's marketized in an economy. So it counts how much we're spending, whether it's government or businesses or consumers. And so you and I doing this podcast, this is our time. That's not counted because we're not spending money on it. But then if someone was to, for example, pay the subscription or to buy this podcast or to buy this pen that I'm holding up, that would be counted in GDP. So you can imagine when people look at their lives, there's loads of really important aspects of lives that aren't something that's traded in the marketplace. So GDP won't see that. It also doesn't really capture the distribution of wealth. So you can see that almost the tyranny of averages will mask inequalities in a country. And the other problem I have with GDP is that it gives perverse incentives to government. So if people are healthy and safe, and so not spending money on anti-anxiety drugs or security systems because they're not scared of each other, GDP actually won't move. And so that could be seen as, problematic. So people, governments get these signals that spending more money on something is a good thing when actually that could be spending to fix and repair. To be honest, I really feel sorry for GDP, Ingrid. It's almost like a shoe that's had too big a foot put in it, and so it's breaking at the seams because it's been overused beyond what it was ever intended to do. And of course, governments have loads of other statistics that they look at. I think the problem with GDP is it's just used as a shortcut. It's used as a default. It's used as a shorthand for how we think about the success of the economy. And because of global rules, because of geopolitics, that's also become associated with the success of a country. And so governments really feel that they need to increase economic growth, which they measure by GDP, though the two aren't exactly the same.
And probably quite naively, like you said, I didn't actually realise until recently that things like a country spending X amount of money on healthcare or the prison system or something contributes to GDP. So if a country's really sick and, say, crime is high, through that metric they're seen as successful, which is quite mind-blowing.
All sorts of fascinating sort of statistical stories of different governments wanting to increase their GDP and therefore tweaking what they include in it. So Italy, for example, adding in organised crime and prostitution and the drug trade. So, that counts, boosting its GDP. And so it is really a flawed measure of progress. And it's also, I think there's something also more about the zeitgeist underneath it, this idea that more of anything is a good thing. Everything that's marketized is also a good thing. And yet when we look at, what really makes good lives for people, it's not necessarily having infinite amounts of stuff, absolutely having enough. That's vitally important. So for folks or countries or communities that don't have enough, but after a certain point, you can get to a point where you have enough, and it's also doing things in community and relationships and time in nature that really makes the difference to people. And the key thing is there's a material basis to that. So if you don't have a job that enables you to spend time with your family because you're having to work 3 jobs on minimum wages, for example, then you're going to struggle to be able to have the sort of quality of life that you want. So the economy matters here, but it's not everything. So there's sort of these different questions around how is the economy supporting people to live the sort of lives they want to live.
Yes, and it's a complete change in perception of which you alluded to, like what success is.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And you think of how countries conceptualize their success so often is where they rank in international GDP tables. And that's reinforced by geopolitics, in that the entry ticket to various decision-making groups like the G7, the G20, literally is how big is your country's GDP. And so power on the international stage and prowess and big photos with other leaders follows GDP. But also for people here in Australia, often it's, there was a news report here in Canberra a few weeks ago of how Canberrans have the second biggest houses in the world. And I wasn't surprised when that came out in the news, because it's really struck me of how people are here in Canberra, they're knocking down sort of 1950s houses and they're building enormous properties,
Yes.
huge properties, which to me, I can't help thinking are sort of outward displays of wealth.
Yes.
In a way, individuals doing that, it's hard to step off that treadmill and chart a different course when that's the system you're stuck in as well. So there's something, really, really sad going on, and pressures that puts on families to work more, to maintain the mortgage, to keep those debt payments going, to have the big house. And then what's the cost of that? Time with kids, time with community, just time on your own in, sitting under a tree or reading a book or cooking, or there's so many perverse incentives for individuals as well.
Yeah, and I wonder, there's a lot of correlation, or there's a common theme, say, between, or it seems like there's a common theme between, say, like individuals, businesses, and then even countries in terms of this more growth is everything, almost the need for the external to fill and to kind of be seen as successful, that theme runs both from the macro down to the micro.
Absolutely. And with businesses as well, as you said, I always think that profit is like the business's equivalent of GDP for governments. So you've got so many amazing businesses out there that are saying, of course we need to be commercially viable, but we're doing that in order to be able to deliver other benefits, and that what I describe as pro-social businesses. And there's all sorts of different business models that they can set themselves up with to deliver that. And then you have other businesses that are really set up in a way that's in their DNA to pursue short-term profit. And that comes with all sorts of costs and all sorts of perverse choices being made by businesses, probably that most of the people in the business themselves don't want to be making. But GDP is acting as that really narrow straitjacket. Sorry, profit is acting as that really narrow straitjacket for business, the same way GDP does often for governments. Yeah, so it's very much a parallel there.
Kind of coming back to what you said about the disconnection within businesses, people may not even know, because they're kind of maybe more siloed, they're not aware about the impact they're having, because they're just in their own lane. There's not that kind of whole thinking across the board.
Yeah, I think the visual of being in your own lane is a really, really good one, because I think often it's the systems within an enterprise, within a business, that compel people or constrain them to make certain choices. I think people are, they go into, their day at work as a citizen, as a family member, as a neighbour. And then it's how they're incentivized, it's the choices they're able to make, it's their promotion, it's their remuneration, it's often the ownership of the business that matters as well, who's making decisions in the business. It's all these other slightly external factors to them, so that, the visual of a lane, maybe with some pretty, high walls between each person's lane, really constrains individuals and almost compels them to tread a certain course that they may not, as humans, want. I don't think there's that number of evil people working for businesses making them. I mean, there is evidence that there's a higher number of psychopaths as CEOs of businesses. By no means do I think that the vast majority of people working in enterprise are psychopaths. I think the vast majority of them are amazing people with passions and concerns and awareness of the world, who, though, are often compelled, explicitly or implicitly, to tread a course that may not align with who they are as humans.
And it's very easy, but people in those positions have targets and KPIs, and you just get into that mind frame. And like you said, there's nothing, they're not necessarily, bad. It's just that they're in that system and that world.
Yeah, and if they have got the big house that's required them to have the big mortgage, and they've got that big house because they're wanting to fit in and show a certain status and be part of a certain way of thinking about success, then that compels them to, take certain jobs that are going to pay off that mortgage and so on. So you just get this quite vicious cycle. And there's a beautiful phrase from one of my many intellectual heroes, Manfred Max Neef, and he's a Chilean, he passed away a few years ago. He's a Chilean economist, and he talks about how this idea of fundamental human needs, that people, wherever they are in the world, almost have this sort of shared commonality of human needs. And of course, how we go about satisfying them will differ wherever you are in the world. But deep down, people really share the need for relationships, for a sense of dignity, for purpose, of course, having enough, so shelter and enough food and so on. And then he says, so we satisfy them in different ways. And then he says, but beware of pseudo-satisfiers. And I think that's a very, very powerful phrase, of pseudo-satisfiers. And I think a really good example of that is people's really innate, very human need for belonging, for social connection, for affiliation. So often, and you see this, I think, with a lot of young kids today, is they're reaching for consumerism and sort of social media, sort of certain profile to belong. And there's something really sad about that. And Ingrid, what's incredible is that advertisers are getting very, very, very good at using that and tapping into it. There's an ad by Ray-Bans online, quite a cool, upbeat kind of song. And it's all about belonging. It's about belonging to your friends, to your street, to your sports team. And then at the end, it just sort of says belong, by Ray-Bans effectively. And so, but that's them very cleverly tapping into our human need. No one needs Ray-Bans. Yeah, we might need sunglasses to protect our eyes. But what do we really need is belonging and a connection and affiliation. And sunglasses won't do it.
Yes, I've thought recently about a person's need to belong, and it often coming across or being, I guess, satisfied in like, I'm vegan or I'm paleo or I'm keto. And I've been thinking about it, and yes, people may love eating like that, but I actually think it's this like, that's my tribe. That's what I identify as, rather than just belonging to your community or just being a human. People are looking for these, almost new tribes to be a part of.
Do you know, there's something really powerful in that way of understanding it, because I think we also see that in terms of different issues. And again, it almost comes back to the sort of segmentation of issues. You're either focused on a particular narrow political interest and really head down fighting for that particular cause or that identity or that group, and not being able to find common ground and shared battles, I guess, with folks who are working on some of those common root causes. One of the phrases I'm so often saying to folks I speak to is we just need to start channeling our inner 3-year-old. And, your little inner 3-year-old's always asking why. That's what we need to do. And really see, then you can start to see those patterns across those issues. And then when you see patterns, there's something structural going on, something systemic, and you can join up and start to take action there. But I think not enough of that is happening at the moment. Even within the economic system change movement, and this big sort of disparate, diverse, amazing movement of folks working to transform the economy, you see people saying, well, it has to be about universal basic income, or it's about circular economy, or it's about beyond GDP measures. And actually, all of that is important. All of it we're going to need to change and transform.
And I think that, but why philosophy, I guess you could call it, is really important, because it makes it just conversations about things like changing the economy accessible. Because I think often, particularly when it comes to, say, like the need to change an economic system, people who don't have an in-depth understanding of what our system is or how it could be different are almost scared by having that conversation because they're not an expert. But just that philosophy of but why just enables people to ask a question.
Yeah, and to not take at face values all these symptoms of the fallout, all the collateral damage. And that's where, that leads up, and we have to respond to that. That's acute need. But it's also, if we keep doing that, we're just playing whack-a-mole. And I think you're right. I think the economy is so often dressed up as something that's remote, that's also the preserve of people who have economics and accounting degrees, and no one else can go there. And it's also often implied that the economy cannot be changed. And yet the economy is shaped by decisions we all make. It's shaped by decisions politicians make. And it absolutely can be changed and transformed. And yeah, it's hard work to do that because there's a lot of vested interests, there's a lot of path dependencies. And also, this is also not just about one policy here or there. This is about a mindset shift in government, I think, particularly, but also how we talk about the economy. So it's not easy, but it's absolutely possible because there's nothing inevitable. You know, the economy is not like gravity. It's not automatically has to be the way it is. And we've seen, even in different countries, different approaches to the economy.
So I guess on that, what countries would you say at the moment are doing things well, or as, you know, in the best way possible? And can you see this shift happening, this move away from how we currently kind of shape our economy?
So no country is doing this completely. What I think we're seeing is different little isolated examples of the sorts of things we would want more of. And so we're seeing, we can put together we can point to examples of different things. And even in Australia, it's loads and loads of good stuff happening. I think the conversation in Europe feels a lot more aligned with the realities of the 21st century than, to be honest, the conversation in Australia does. I think Europe's really starting to, well, it's explicitly saying it wants to move to a wellbeing economy. Its 8th Environmental Action Plan that came out about a year ago now, it has an explicit statement of building towards a wellbeing economy. They've got a massive conference coming up in May around beyond growth, saying, you know, can we imagine an economy that's better than growth? And given all that we know about the links between economic growth and environmental impact, but also the fact that growth hasn't done enough, as I was saying earlier, with the example of Glasgow, to deliver good lives to people. We need better recipes now. So it's starting to take that on very, very seriously. And then individual countries. I mean, one of the ones I really find exciting is the cooperative movement, so worker co-ops. And there are places like the north of Italy, where in a region called Emilia-Romagna, where there's a huge percentage of co-ops in the local economy. And the Italian constitution has supportive clauses to support, you know, co-ops and umbrella groups. In Scotland, there's a part of the Scottish Enterprise Agency, so there's government's enterprise arm that is supporting encouragement of cooperatives, particularly when owners of a business are wanting to retire. Really, that juncture there to make the most of that. You know, can we maybe transfer it to the workers, and so the workers become owners? I think there's a lot of moves, say, in places like Austria for the economy for the common good, and really starting to have different accounting sheets for businesses. And in terms of what governments are doing in their own measures of progress, over half of the OECD governments have multidimensional wellbeing frameworks. So I mentioned earlier Scotland's National Performance Framework, and how Australia is just starting to think about having a wellbeing framework. I mean, the fact that over half of the OECD countries already have these shows that Australia's got a bit of a catch up to do, but it also shows that it's not enough, because it certainly doesn't mean that over half the OECD countries are well on their way to aligning their economies with much more of what people and planet need. I mean, there's so many examples I could keep pointing to, whether that's, you know, local community gardens, whether it's cities that are pedestrianising their streets, whether it's community-owned renewables in Denmark, whether it's Sweden reducing its tax on repairing goods, whether it's France and Italy banning food waste, and France and Europe banning planned obsolescence, whether it's Bhutan's gross national happiness, or whether it's Thailand's sufficiency economy. I mean, whether it's Seoul and South Korea really pushing for the sharing economy. There are so many examples out there. And I hope, you know, listeners will also be thinking, oh, yeah, there's this I know, or down my local street, there's this really cool social enterprise, or there's a community garden, or even those tiny little street libraries. They are tiny things, but they're examples of a different way of sharing goods and services with each other. So they're really symbolic, and they're really important as just little steps away from the recipes of the 20th century, where everything was marketized, everything was seen in your value of how much you make, how much you earn, how much you have and own.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. in the sense of it can look small and insignificant, but actually it's all of those little things that add up, and it allows people or one to change their perception. So if it's reducing the amount of books you buy and you get them from those little street libraries and then put them back and things like that, or only one person on the street having a lawnmower and everyone then just shares that because you use it once every 2 weeks.
Exactly. Yeah, tool libraries are a cracking example, and toy libraries as well. I mean, such a beautiful example. And there's one of the first ones in Australia was in Brisbane. It got sadly hit by the Brisbane floods a few years ago. But here in Canberra, where I am, there's a tool library as well. There's amazing groups in Canberra called Buy Nothing groups. I'm sure there's something similar in other cities where you just have people posting. And I saw the other day someone had said, oh, here's a tin of Milo. I didn't like it, but I've only tried one spoon. If anyone wants it, we put our dishwasher and we gifted that away. It's just a different way of providing for each other. And you're right. At first glance, they're small, but change happens at the margins. It doesn't happen in the mainstream. And what happens at the margins, the more people start to see it and start to think, I could do that too, and start to replicate it, then you start to move towards a tipping point and maybe even a new normal. And the key thing there is all those good things will happen despite the way the policy regime works. So we also need to say to governments and policymakers and politicians, look what's happening. You need to help this. You need to enable more of this to happen. You need to change the rules of the game to encourage and support that sort of activity. So there's sort of all layers of that system. It's sort of individual activities, but also the policy, but then also the questions we ask about the economy as well.
And you sort of touched on this earlier, and I've heard you talk about it before, but kind of this notion of Band-Aid solutions. Yes, I'd love you to kind of chat about that, because I think it's so important in this discussion.
Yeah. I think I used the phrase earlier of whack-a-mole. It's so often social policy, and to be honest, a lot of charity work is at that downstream acute need, and it's responding to a crisis. It's responding to the immediate collateral damage of things that have deeper roots. If we took the time to channel our inner 3-year-old and ask why. And so I don't begrudge that. That's really important in a system that is doing that damage, because it helps people survive and cope with today and tomorrow, or help, responds to environmental breakdown as well. But it costs a lot of money, a lot of resource. And, once you start hearing government announcements with this in the back of your mind, you will see that so much of what government does is just that survival and coping and responding after the fact, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, downstream. And the key thing is damage has been done. It's easy to measure, though. We can count it. We can tally up those numbers, and they will increase GDP as well. The more we're spending on anti-anxiety drugs, the more we're spending on security systems, the more we're spending on repairing houses after a massive flood, that will all add to GDP. And so again, this perverse incentives in this measure that we used as a sort of shorthand for the success of a country is almost encouraging those downstream solutions, and it won't smile when we get things right first time round. So I think we're almost in this sort of hamster wheel of just responding crisis by crisis, whack-a-mole sort of game we're playing, as profoundly inefficient in its own terms. It's expensive, it's draining, and the key thing is it means damage has been done that we could have avoided. I mean by society, if we'd created an economy that helped people live good lives first time round and didn't damage the planet and then require repair.
This is a very, very simplistic way to think about it. And I obviously know it's not this simple. But like you said, it's also just a simple mindset shift in the sense of away from fear to almost connection, let's say. Like if you think about how much we spend on, say, military, whatever our military budget is, I'm not sure what that is, but it's massive.
Billions and billions and billions.
Yes. Like imagine if, obviously keep some of that, but imagine if some of that was funneled into keeping people healthy from the get-go, or building communities, or helping people out of, poverty, whatever it might be. The money exists there. It's just being spent in particular ways.
Yeah, reacting and repairing and responding. And, you know, it's obviously so important today and tomorrow. But I think there has to come a time where collectively we raise our gaze and we say, we've got to do better than this. We can't keep responding crisis to crisis to crisis. And we have to start looking at those root causes. And there's a term that comes from management literature, actually, of failure demand. And this idea that the more demand for a service isn't necessarily a sign of success. It could be a sign of failure. So think about, complaints to a call center, for example, for a business. And it was used about just over 10 years ago in Scotland. There was a huge report in Scotland on the future of public services in Scotland, a report called the Christie Commission. And they used that term failure demand and they applied it to government. And they estimated very, very conservatively that at least half of what just local authorities, so local government spend, is driven by poverty and inequality. And you can imagine it too when you think of things like remedial education, because of kids not turning up to school prepared. Food banks would be another example. A lot of accident and emergency, a lot of the criminal justice system, all sorts of things. It's like an onion. You'll see it everywhere. I mean, here in Australia, in Melbourne, they've appointed heat officers to help vulnerable people cope with extreme heat. Now, really important work. And one of my friends has been appointed one of them. So really important work. But isn't that just a sign that, one, we're pushing the planet beyond what she can handle? And we've got these extreme heat waves that we're going to see more and more of. But also that there are vulnerable people who are unable to protect themselves. And to me, it's just such a tiny example. In the UK, over the last winter that they've just come out of, not only did they have food banks, and a lot of people were working, still having to go to food banks to put food on the table for their families. They've now also introduced warm banks. So places like museums and libraries and local sports centres, where people who can't afford to keep their houses warm, either because their houses are so profoundly inefficient and leak energy, and also because energy costs are so high, could go and be warm in these warm banks. And you can see what beautiful sort of neighbourly response people setting up those food banks or warm banks are. But to me, they're such an extraordinarily sign of how bad things are in the first place. And so the goal has to be imagining a society where we don't need heat officers, where we don't need food banks, we don't need warm banks, we don't need so much treatment for people feeling anxious and stressed about their lives, where people aren't lonely, where young kids aren't scared for their future. We have to be able to imagine that. We have to.
And again, I think it's a shift from short-term thinking to long-term. So like you said, these needs are acute and they're necessary because people can't be, freezing in their home. But it's that short-term, it's a short-term solution. So now what's the longer-term solution? And I've always thought, again, I'm definitely not a political expert, but I've always thought, even, the way the political system is set up, it's 4-year term, say. So half of that's probably spent campaigning and those sorts of things. So how much can you actually achieve, and how much fundamental change can you actually achieve, in a short amount of time? And again, I've heard you talk about, I'm completely blanking on the name, but an initiative in Scotland where I think it was 100 people coming together.
Oh, the Citizens' Assemblies work.
Yeah, Citizens' Assembly.
Yeah, Citizens' Assemblies are fantastic. And I think Australia should really get amongst it, because they're beautiful examples of where you get everyday people together to wrestle with some of these bigger, knottier questions. And so the idea is it's an example of participatory democracy. So not just, a more active involvement in democracy than just voting every couple of years and then washing your hands of it. So what happens is, they select, you get, really real experts selecting people so that they represent the wider population. So in this case, they're like a mini Scotland, 100 people that are illustrative of Scotland in terms of gender, age, education, where they live, ethnicity, disability status, views on the particular issues as well. And they come together regularly, sort of for deep dive weekends. So it's an amazing gift that the participants give to the issue, to the cause. And they've taken place on all sorts of different topics. So in Ireland, very famously, they had one on abortion. And you can imagine how fraught the abortion question is on Ireland. And it changed the views, not only of participants, but of government officials and politicians. And now Ireland has brought in abortion rights for women on the basis of the Citizens' Assembly journey. In the UK, there's been big citizens' assemblies around climate issues. It was one of Extinction Rebellion's big request, and that happened. And in Scotland, there's been one on really the future of Scotland and one on environment and climate too. So I was part of those in a really small way, but absolutely beautiful experience. And the Scottish one, if I've got time to tell you a little bit about it, they had these meetings over really how can Scotland respond in a just way to the climate emergency, or some variation of that overriding topic. And so they came out with a suite of recommendations, things like frequent flyer taxes, things like passive home standards, so that all new builds had a lighter environmental footprint, things like different measures of progress beyond GDP, pro-social business models, whole wide range of ideas they came up with. And what's beautiful is that you see they split up into groups, and they get people who are expert on a particular topic come in and talk to them and share information, and the participants question them and they bring their own ideas. It's lightly facilitated, but it's very much about the citizens, the participants themselves, just working through these topics. So they came up with this bunch of ideas, took them to the Scottish government, and the Scottish government responded. And then the participants said, we've got to meet again. We have to have another weekend. And this was all through COVID, so it was on Zoom for a weekend, and that's exhausting. But they put up their hands and said, we've got to meet again, because the Scottish government's response is not good enough. Mm-hmm. And so they reconvened when they thought their experience had been over. They reconvened as an assembly and then wrote back to the Scottish government and said, not good enough. You're not grappling with the urgency of action here. And that's really powerful, I think. And hopefully I was back in Scotland earlier this year, and I started to see a couple of the policies start to being enacted. So one, the Passive House is an example that they've just started to legislate that all new social housing in Scotland will have to meet Passive House standards. So that's an example of also galvanizing people together, helping them feel more informed and in control. And the other pattern I've noticed with other citizens' assemblies and this one is their recommendations will be so much bolder than what most politicians are prepared to talk about. And I think it just proves that this line of, the public is not up for it, is such rubbish. If you bring people together, give them a chance to reflect and talk and understand and learn, they are really up for the change that's needed.
Yes, and it introduces a sense of autonomy and, again, accessibility, because it's not someone on a TV screen telling us what's wrong and what the solution is. It gives a bit of autonomy back to the community and, the people at large.
Exactly, which, to come back to the early part of our conversation, we know autonomy is such an important fundamental human need. So almost these democratic exercises are also an example of realigning with what people truly, truly need. So they're not just feeling, washed away or, damaged or buffeted by bigger processes they have no control over. Getting involved in these sorts of things are really important antidotes to feeling out of control and not feeling you have autonomy over your lives and decisions that impact you.
And I've just thought, as you were just speaking, I wonder if that lack of autonomy is why people can become so black and white in their, let's say political views, and I'm this party or that party, because it's a way to control, the belief, and it gives you some sense of power in a situation where people can feel very powerless.
Control very much. I mean, you see, there's been really, really beautifully but sad research done in the States by Angus Deaton and Anne Case. Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago, and what they've described it is the deaths of despair is this term, and it describes people in, I guess it's sort of upper working class communities who maybe in the post-war era would have had decent jobs in factories, jobs for life, would have known their community. And they've just seen with various political and economic shifts how that life is changing so profoundly, and also how the material basis of that life is being ripped out from under their feet with closure of those factories, with the economic changes in America, and also with the extraction of wealth upwards to the very top, to the owners of capital. So those workers are not getting decent wages anymore, and we see in the US and places like Australia that sort of flatlining of real wages for the vast majority of people, and yet this is a cohort of folks who are dying prematurely, whether through suicide or alcohol or opioid, or through heart conditions as well that are often linked to sort of unhealthy lifestyles. And so what Deaton and Case have described this as these deaths of despair, that they're just despairing over their future. That idea that you could hope, almost know and rest assured that your kids' lives would be better than yours doesn't exist anymore. And these are folks who are probably maybe not even clocking the environmental breakdown that's coming, but just economically seeing a sense of hopelessness, and how that then has a physiological impact and is leading to premature deaths. And the economy does this. This is the economy.
I've heard, again, the way of thinking in certain kind of communities and tribes used to be about, well, this decision, decisions or issues were looked at from how it would impact the past kind of generations and the future generations. So that kind of, which is a beautiful way of...
Yeah, there's a 7th generation principle that a lot of First Nations communities have, which is just fantastic, and decisions taken collectively. I think it comes back to a point you were making earlier, Ingrid, around short-term decision-making in political cycles, and how can we help politicians break out of that? And, the irony is politicians are actually really good at thinking long-term, when it's, submarine deals, as we're hearing in the news this month, whether it's building a massive toll road that will, probably be, opened many years after their time in office. So you can see that politicians can do it on certain topics, and yet when it comes to thinking of environmental issues and social justice issues, you just see it's short-term crisis response. And so one of the good things about this idea of bringing sort of well-being thinking more into government through better measures of progress is that it has the potential to aid that longer-term thinking and helping government departments work together much more collectively. So not just in their narrow little lane, in their narrow confines of their departmental title or their job title, but to start to take the time to see the connections between their work, and also see how the causes of what different government departments are responding to are linked to actions in another department. And a good example of that is, for example, if the education department is doing its job well, the Justice Department will see the benefit of that on their bottom line, because there'll be less crime. We know those. These interlinkages are really real.
Yes. I just have 2 last questions for you. I don't want to keep you too long. We've spoken kind of about how it can look like this change can look from maybe like an individual and community level. But on a business level, how does this kind of shift in thinking look? I believe that Philips has kind of an interesting way of...
their lights. Yeah, the Lux. Yeah, they're quite a lovely, famous example of Philips of saying, you don't actually need the light bulb. What you need is the light that it emits. And so they've started thinking about this unit, it's beautiful, called Lux. Sort of that's a unit of light. And so Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam it's a really famous example where Philips has engaged with them to make sure they'll supply light. And then it's up to Philips to figure out how to do that in terms of light bulbs in the ceiling or so on. And then one of the benefits is then Philips has an incentive to put in really long-lasting light bulbs. And if you haven't seen the beautiful little documentary called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, it's really worth watching, because it's an example of planned obsolescence of light bulbs. Used to last really, really, really long. And then light bulb manufacturers thought, oh, hang on, we're not making any money here because people aren't buying more light bulbs. So let's make them last less. And now, of course, there is, because of regulation and agitation, there is a movement now to longer lasting light bulbs as well. But it's an example of planned obsolescence, but Philips has gone a bit further than that. And there's lots of other examples now. I mean, the car hire, and where it's your access to the service that matters, not so much your personal ownership. So, micro car hire is an example of that. Cooperative housing is another example of that. Book sharing we were talking about earlier. So there's sort of this movement, that this collaborative economy, the sharing economy, not so much the sort of Uber, Airbnb, but collaboration with each other's, where what matters is that your access is your freedom rather than your extent of ownership. So there's great examples of that. And there's so many other businesses that are getting involved in the circular economy as well, thinking we can't just throw away waste because we know that's got an environmental impact. And there's good examples of governments starting to charge for that as well. So that changes the profit, the balance sheet for businesses. So they're saying, how can we better it? Say, there's a brilliant example of an organization that makes beautiful face serums and hand creams and face rubs out of old coffee grind, coffee grains. My favorite example is a brewer outside Glasgow who makes a line of beer with old bread that came from a nearby bakery. So it's a great example. And I think there's lots of businesses that are really questioning their role in being part of a positive solution and saying, right, let's think about our products. Let's also think about our role in the community. But it also means they have to think about their ownership, who owns them, who takes decisions, and where finance goes. And is finance and money being extracted up to remote shareholders? Or is it owned by the community? Or is it owned by workers? What different models are out there. And I think there's so many great examples. It's really exciting what's happening in the enterprise space.
Yes, and I think Patagonia is a good example of that. They seem to be the pinnacle of what good business can be.
Yeah, and there's heaps of others too. There's a cosmetic company called Faith in Nature. It's an Edinburgh-based company. They have just appointed to their board someone whose job it is to represent nature. So there's someone sitting in the boardroom fighting for nature. That explicit, God. And then there's massive companies like the big UK sort of supermarket, Waitrose and John Lewis. They're all owned by their staff. It's a worker cooperative. They're partners. Yeah, they're not called employees. They're called partners. The big engineering firm, Arup, I think they designed the Sydney Opera, or built the Sydney Opera House. Again, they're sort of, more worker co-op. The really famous one that folks often point to is Mondragon, comes out of the Basque region in Spain. But it's also, really small ones too, like enterprises who are just saying, yeah, we need to be commercially viable, but for a purpose. So in Glasgow, all the restaurants and cafes have this beautiful bread that comes from a place called Freedom Bakery. And that's working with folks inside prisons to teach them baking skills. And it's a social enterprise. So they're not trying to extract a ton of profit up to shareholders. They use their money to just deliver good services for prisoners through training and coaching and mentoring, but awesome bread that is now, everyone buys Freedom Bakery bread in Glasgow because it's such yummy bread as well.
Yes. And people want to be part of the change. So buying that bread is actually a fundamental part of making the change.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess on that question, if there were, say, just 3 things that individuals, the layman could do to be part of the change and the shift? What would you say that the top three things are that people can do?
So this might be entirely predictable. It's just keep asking why. So not take at face value why there are more folks sleeping rough in doorways in Australia, why young people are scared for their future because of in the face of climate change, why more and more people are lonely and why suicide rates are rising, but really take the time to ask that why question and look upstream. And I guess that to the second one then is to just have those conversations and to engage in discussion, and that helps you and others to think differently about the economy and start to imagine something different, start to imagine something better. And the other thing is to support those pioneers. I mean, we were saying earlier how change happens at the margins in the small scale, but the more people who hear about those pioneers, the more support they get, more powerful they'll be, the more replication there will be, and the more flourishing of the sort of practices that we need more of. So it's sort of ask why, have more conversations, and support the pioneers would be my 3 tips.
And my very, very last question, but do you feel hopeful about the future and that we can get there?
I feel hopeful when I'm with people who are part of making change. So, and I'm lucky in that my work, I'm with people a lot. But if I'm really, really honest, the enormity of change required, I don't see the policy world engaging with the level of change in nearly serious enough ways, making big enough changes in the time that's needed. We're still in that tweaking the current system stage, and that does worry me. But I take hope from how many people are just not waiting for permission and rolling up their sleeves and building change in the here and now. So that's where I get my hope. I'm not always hopeful that we'll do it enough in fast enough time, but we just have to keep working.
Believing that it can be different and being hopeful is an important part of, the change itself.
Yeah, exactly. And it gives you that sense that you're contributing and you're part of something bigger.
Exactly.
Because the alternative to that is despair.
Exactly. And I think also remembering that around issues that have needed like fundamental change, like civil rights movements or women having the vote, all of those things came from the ground up. It wasn't the policy that started, it was the people who needed the policy to change. That's actually where it started.
Yeah, exactly. And through collective action, amazing things can happen. And through collaboration, real change can come.